All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're broadcasting live from Studio Q here at QLI. I've got Steve Kershke and Brad Dexter here with us today. They're going to be presenting on demystifying the physical aspects of telerehabilitation. Steve, how long you been at QLI now?
About 13 years with a couple years in between where I lost my way.
And so for 10 years of that, you were a clinician, correct?
Yeah, physical therapist by trade. Actually worked pretty closely with Brad and worked on our spinal cord injury team, pain team, brain injury side of things. So I've had the opportunity to work on quite a few projects here at QI.
Okay. And can you talk a little bit about maybe the transition in those last 3 years more to your current title, which is director of marketing, and maybe some of the things that's allowed you to focus on to benefit our clinical program here.
Certainly, I'm a clinician at heart, but having the opportunity to work on other business aspects is definitely something that I found exciting. And I knew pretty early on in my even school career that physical therapy was interesting, but not my end goal necessarily. So it's been nice to have a chance to work alongside other folks at the company to build programs, really get involved in the work comp arena, which has been really exciting. Never thought I'd work in workers comp, but that's been really great to build some good relationships across the country and have the opportunity to talk about QLI, which is something obviously we're all pretty passionate about around here.
Absolutely. And I think in particular with our telerehabilitation or just telerehab in general, it's been something that you've kind of spearheaded on this campus and wrapped in some pretty amazing clinicians like Brad, which I'm going to let you go ahead and do a quick introduction for him.
Yeah, we're lucky to have a really solid team. I think we're kind of on the naughty list with some of the other folks around QLI because we poached some of our really good clinicians and pulled them over to the telerehab side at least for part time. So Brad fits the mold there, and Brad and I have worked together for a long time, and just fortunate to have him here today to share a little bit about his experience. He's really the one on the front lines delivering the therapy. And so I'm excited to have him share a little bit about that experience and how he's grown as a clinician and some of the challenges that we're still facing. But ultimately, just really cool to have you work alongside me.
Yeah.
Ready to roll?
I think so. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to pass the mouse over to you guys so you guys can
All
take
right.
control and ready to rock.
All right. So, as we were talking about this, actually, this commercial, I don't know if you guys remember this, came out in 1997. Short story about this is the agency that worked on this with Apple actually went in. Steve Jobs actually thought that the content was terrible and didn't like it at first. He thought that at the time Apple was hemorrhaging cash; they were about ready to fold, and they knew that they needed to do something big. And so the agency proposed that they do a commercial rather than the print ads that Steve Jobs actually wanted to do. They felt that they were going to have to do something creative in order to show people that as an organization they were creative. And the crazy ones, the video, if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. It's actually really cool. Came out and won a ton of awards, and immediately within about 12 months shifted Apple's fortune. And if you guys also remember back, that was about the time that Apple came out with those candy colored computers. And a lot of folks would say that because of this ad, people actually took them seriously rather than thinking that they were just another toy. So a couple of things that stick out here. We're not necessarily claiming to be misfits or rebels. Maybe Tim's a misfit, but um, we'll leave that up to you guys to determine. But I think Brad and I have both felt the challenges, especially with launching telerehab. And this no respect for the status quo is something that we've talked quite a bit about and is a big reason why we launched this program. That being said, we still have days where we look at each other and say, "Man, is this something that we can pull off here?" But the cool thing is that we're having really great outcomes, and it's being very well accepted. And the other reason we wanted to throw this up here today was you all might be feeling the same way about telerehab, telemedicine. In general, I think folks are accepting of this approach. But when it comes to the physical aspects of telerehab, that's where I've seen a lot of the skepticism. I don't know if you felt the same thing, Brad. A lot of the skepticism because of the traditional thought around physical therapy and occupational therapy. So we just hope that as you listen to this today, that you can broaden your perspective a little bit, and we're going to hopefully help you try to wrap your head around how this can be done at a really high level.
Mhm.
So just to jump in to make sure we're all on the same page, those of you who tuned into our last one, this is going to be a little bit of a review, but want to make sure we're starting from the same point in time. So telemedicine and you'll see here telehealth are both broad terms describing the delivery of care using technology. And as you know, today we're talking about telerehabilitation. So this is really a more specific term to describe the delivery of conventional therapy. And in this case today, we're talking about physical and occupational therapy. You could even broaden it to personal training, that sort of thing. But doing that using the same technology that we've talked about. Primarily, we're talking about asynchronous uh, delivery. And if you excuse me, we're going to be talking about synchronous delivery. But if you think about asynchronous, think about email. All of you guys are receiving probably um, tens to hundreds of emails as you're taking your time out of your day to join us. That's a form of asynchronous communication. You receive it, and then you can respond to it at a different point in time. What we're talking about primarily is the synchronous form. If you think FaceTime, those of you guys who are another reference to Apple iPhone users, FaceTime is a perfect example of synchronous communication. That's been the majority of our approach, although we do use some asynchronous strategies to help the individuals that we're working with. We're not going to talk much about this today, but the remote patient monitoring aspect is something that we're looking heavily at. We've had a few individuals where they've made enough progress and we really need to back off our support and observe and see how they do. And remote patient monitoring is a way that we can do that. So we're excited to hopefully share a little bit more about our experience with that later on. But just to know that that is something else to consider when you think of telerehab. So the next few slides, we're going to talk about the status quo. And this one right here, physical and occupational therapy requires hands-on support to be effective. Brad and I would definitely consider this to be a status quo comment. We have seen several examples of how you don't need to be hands-on. And when we're talking about hands-on, we talk about hands-on from a clinician or some sort of caregiver, friend, family, whoever that might be. And so we're going to go on to show you that there are certainly situations where having someone hands-on and in person is necessary, but there's plenty of other situations where we can be more consultative. Brad's gotten really good at using his directional skills to explain different activities and orient people in a certain way to be effective at completing activities. So we really believe that this statement is the status quo, and if you look beyond that, there's lots of ways to work around it.
Yeah, I think one thing that's always stuck with me from when I had gone through physical therapy school, it's been, you know, 11 years since I started that now, but one of the first things they told us was, we're going to teach you how to think about things and not just what to do. There's certainly a what to do component, but that's something that's stuck with me and that I've always just thought about in the ways that I treat people and educate them or their family members. Because really, at the end of the day, I want them, if they're able to know how to think about how to do things moving forward,
Mhm.
to think critically about them and not just learn specific things to do so that they can't keep advancing or getting better. So I think telerehab is a great example of applying that too. You're trying to teach individuals, their caregivers or family members how to think about things so they're not just stuck in one spot. But listen, I'm not always going to be here from a therapy standpoint. And these are concepts that you guys need to remember moving forward so you can keep challenging your loved one.
Yeah, absolutely. So they can think on their own, right?
Mhm.
So This thing makes me think of, so my son Charlie, he is playing basketball, and we have this coach in the area who works with a group of kids. And certainly I love the fact that he's getting exposed to basketball at a higher level. But honestly, the time that he spends with that coach is so much more valuable because the coach encourages him to read defenses and think for himself. And
Hmm.
he's asking him to think critically about what's going on. And Charlie's in second grade,
Yep.
right? And so, I think a lot of times we look at these individuals, especially the ones that we work with, and we maybe don't expect enough from them.
Hmm.
But the reality is, the more we expect from them, and the more of an opportunity we take to teach and train them to be their own decision makers, to think critically and apply the skills that we're trying to give to them, I think the better off they are, and ultimately they become less dependent on us as clinicians,
Absolutely.
which I think is a really cool thing. Terrible business model, but
Yeah.
but a really cool thing to see.
Yep.
All right, next status quo statement. We are not considering telerehab because there's a local provider. There's a couple levels to this. First and foremost, the local provider is not always the expert provider. And especially with the folks that we deal with, brain injury, spinal cord injury, chronic pain, limb loss, having a local provider might check the box of having someone hands-on, which we've already talked about may or may not be necessary, but it may not check the box of being an expert. And I think that's something to really consider, because it's more than treating the impairment. It's more than making sure that you give them the right exercise program. And it's making sure that emotionally they're taken care of, and cognitively we've put the supports in place to help these individuals, and really looking holistically at their entire life. And I think that's something that you guys as a team have done really well.
Yeah. Having worked on the inpatient side for so long, one of the harder things is always transition for the folks that we're serving back into their local communities' life again. And we've always tried to help with those transitions and be present, even for a couple days when they go back home. But ultimately, like, those individuals and the families are going to be on their own, and they have to figure it out in some ways. And we also try to connect with local therapists. And I've always told the patients that we're serving on an inpatient side, as long as you have a creative therapist back home, you're going to do okay, because they're going to challenge themselves and they're going to push themselves to help you out and not look at just your injury, but some of the impairments that are, you know, with you right now, and just looking at how can we make those better? How can we advance those? Sometimes that doesn't happen, and it can be intimidating, I know, to some therapists if they're working with a new diagnosis or something they don't see too often, as well. Now I'm on the other side of things, where I'm kind of receiving people on that outpatient end through telerehab services. And like you said, Steve, I'm thankful that it's not just me from a PT standpoint in what we're doing, because the emotional and the cognitive components
Mm.
of their ongoing rehab as they transition back into life again is incredibly important. Certainly, the physical component needs to be there, but working alongside OT, speech, and psychology has been incredibly important.
Yeah, there's a collaborative piece to it too.
Yep.
I'm sure you have orthopedic physical therapy friends, as do I, and I've asked several of them, if someone with a brain injury showed up at your clinic, how competent would you feel in taking care of them? And overwhelmingly, they would say, "No, I will leave that to you." And similarly, if I had someone with a really complicated low back situation, I could probably find my way through it, but
Yep.
not having done it every day, I would much rather have someone who sees orthopedic um, situations like that
Yep.
day in and day out handle that. So I mean, I think there's a level of respect there that we have to work through. Certainly, egos can get in the way sometimes, but I
Mhm.
think it's something that um, is a consideration. And obviously, the flip side of the status quo is to understand that local's not always better and maybe more convenient, and it may provide that hands-on, but there's more to consider than that.
Mhm.
All right, telerehab makes sense for clients in rural locations, but not those living in or near a metropolitan city. I've talked about telerehab for the last year now, and the first thing that people say is like, "Oh man, for our folks who live in rural South Dakota or rural wherever, this is a perfect option because they would have to drive 3 hours to get to the nearest clinic, and that clinic may or may not have expertise." So overwhelmingly, people can wrap their heads around the rural location. The metropolitan city has been a bit more of a challenging conversation. And I understand that, right? So certainly the metropolitan city provides this level of convenience. It's in the vicinity. You have that hands-on component. And a lot of our metropolitan cities have centers that say they specialize in whatever the diagnosis may be. And again, great. I mean, I think there are certainly situations where if you live in a city and you have a provider really close to you, you'll get really great care. With that being said, we have had several of our clients who live close to a metropolitan city who've chosen telerehab for various reasons. One being convenience. Even in metropolitan cities, there is this factor of maybe I have to, sit in traffic for an hour one way just to travel 15 miles, or weather. And it's honestly, it's taxing on the person and the caregiver to load up in the car, to park, and to have to get into that clinic physically. And there is this convenience of being able to either do it from your home or do it within your day, and build the therapy around your day rather than having to build your day around your therapy.
Mhm.
And I think that's a really cool option for many of our folks. And so the other thing I would say is we're going to talk a lot about this today is this contextual learning environment. The idea of having to go to a brick and mortar type of facility is not always better. And we've had several situations where you have someone who's going to a really great clinic, and they're getting really, really good care, but there's a piece of the puzzle that continues to be missing when they go home. And the idea that of telerehab is that we get a firsthand glimpse of what that looks like. So I'm sure you've been in that situation too, Brad.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm even thinking about, I have opportunities to give tours to people around QLI often. And one of the things that I always come back to is, listen, we have a lot of gadgets, we have a lot of toys, and we need those. We need to be able to give people that we're serving at this point in their care the opportunities to utilize that equipment in order to get better, right? But at the end of the day, it's not about all of the gadgets and gizmos. It's about the people that are working with
Absolutely.
them. And so from a bricks and mortar standpoint, from a rural versus metropolitan standpoint, I think it really comes down to who do you have working with them, and are they going to get the best care that way?
Absolutely. All right, last one. Client has difficulty accessing technology, so telerehab is not the best option. I think on the front end, we were pretty worried about this, especially with maybe, for lack of a better word, our more mature population. But in all honesty, the folks who didn't grow up with technology, like many of our younger individuals that we work with, and certainly a consideration. The other thing is with our just population in general, not necessarily our spinal cord injury population, but our brain injury population, and the ability to re-access technology and work through the problem solving that needs to happen just to log in and can you remember your passwords and that sort of thing. But the reality is, it's been pretty well adopted by all ages. That's been pretty cool to see.
Mhm.
But I've also enjoyed seeing our team put in some fail safes and put in some supports to help work through that process. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how we do that and some of the things that we've found to be successful.
Yeah, if we're able to, we try to do training up front with people. We certainly have instructions that go out to families or to individuals on how to access everything, but we're also going through that step by step with them. The nice thing about the technology is you can screen share. So if I need to teach someone something on their iPad, for example, I go through a lot of strength training programs with individuals, and we use an app. If we're doing that for the first time, I can have them screen share with me, and it's like I'm looking at the screen with them, right? So I can take them through every single step they need to go through. Very easy for them to follow that. And then from a repetition standpoint, to get to them to the point where they're doing it on their own, it makes it a lot easier because I can just go through it every single time with them. So the technology is there to be able to do it. I think from a therapist side, sometimes you just have to have patience because people aren't always as adept at using that. Just like anything else, you have patience and you kind of teach them through it. So
I don't know about you, but my mom is way better at Facebook than I am. So, I mean, I feel like that's something to think about. Another just sidebar. I don't know if you guys know what TikTok is. Tim and I are talking about TikTok. I have a little niece. She showed me TikTok, so I feel like I'm also in that category of not
Preface:
knowing.
I also did not know TikTok, so
But now I feel like I'm getting old too, and people are going to start talking about me about not knowing technology. So
Yeah.
someday, hopefully, someone will help me, like you've helped some of our folks. So, all right. So just to summarize, especially these top 3 bullets or so, a little bit of a review. So some supports of telerehab is just this idea that expertise and specialty care should not be overlooked. The contextual training environment is, if you don't remember anything from our webinar today, the contextual training environment is the game changer, because you can simulate exactly what the person's going through. You can see exactly the challenges or the successes with your own eyes and make your own judgments. It's such a big deal. And then, folks, from a learning perspective, this is one of the huge learning principles that we talk about each and every day. The context of it has to be there. So we can give you countless examples of this, but the one that I often use is a football team, right? The Super Bowl is coming up, and the Niners are going to try to simulate the Super Bowl as best they can. They're going to simulate the media, they're going to simulate the sound, they're going to simulate all of the aspects of that. And the whole idea is that they're doing that so that there are no surprises on the biggest game of the year. And even when they do that, they are going to run into something that they didn't prepare for. And we see the same thing. The chance
AKA Patrick Mahomes.
Patrick Mahomes is a big deal. I hope Patrick Mahomes kills it. Um, but the reality is, Patrick Mahomes is maybe going to have a trick play, or Andy Reid. Hopefully, he can get that defense going. But they're going to do something that they didn't plan for, and we see that every day. And a brick and mortar clinic, that is a big downside to that, is that you just don't know. So contextual training environment is huge. This convenience aspect is really straightforward. We're also seeing compliance go up pretty heavily. So it's a snow day here in Omaha. So most of our employees are here, but having to bear those elements and navigate the roads is something that is a challenge sometimes, and so this compliance level goes up as well.
Mhm.
Brad alluded to the clinical collaboration that's available with this. Traditionally, you don't get that in an outpatient clinic. You have the physical therapist who's doing his or her thing. You might have an occupational therapist in the same building that generally don't talk to each other. The other thing that we're seeing, and I know we're not talking about this today, is the psychology component, the emotional component, has been huge for us. And we're generally recommending psychology on pretty much every person that transitions from QLI to work in conjunction with Brad, if it's a physical aspect of their care. And it really, there's no substitute for it. So it's a big deal. And then the caregiver consultation and support. So there are lots of situations where the caregiver just needs a blueprint. They just need something and some structure to help them through their day. We're pretty excited. We're going to be partnering with the Heart Association here in Nebraska and doing some real cool things to help survivors of stroke. And it's really based on this caregiver consultative model. So I'm excited to tell you guys more about that. So a little teaser there. And then this isn't all sunshine and roses. Of course, there are still barriers and there are still challenges that we are working through. We're still learning every single day. So we don't want you to leave this presentation thinking that we got it all figured out, because we certainly don't. A couple of things that we're still running up against is this traditional therapy mindset and the decision making around that. Excuse me. Even our clinicians here at QLI are running into that. So we've had to do a lot of education with them, help them understand the capabilities that we have, show them videos, invite them into sessions so that they can see everything that we can do. So I would expect that this continues, and but it is a really cool thing to see people starting to adopt that. The next two, this quality of care and supporting outcome measures. This is, I think, is just a factor because it's new. We're in the early adopter phase. There's skepticism on quality, and there aren't any outcome measures. I can't share a double-blind study with you showing the effectiveness of telerehab. Thankfully, there's more coming out, especially as it relates to the caregiver. So as an example, there's a lot of research about the anxiety and the depression scales of caregivers and just the burden and strain on them. And a lot of the studies are showing that with telerehab, we can have a really marked effect on that. So that's one example of where we are getting some more outcome measures, but the effectiveness of care and that sort of thing is still, lacking.
Yeah, and again, you don't have research on this from a telerehab platform, but you look at some of the individuals that we're serving, and uh, we know that community reintegration is a very, very difficult thing, right? If you can be alongside someone though through this medium of telerehab, where can we take that?
Mhm.
What would that look like in the future? That's what's exciting about it.
Yeah. Well, and just I think of the guy that we worked with who he's a concert, he puts on the concerts,
Yep.
right? And all the things that you guys did with him because he was having a hard time navigating, the dark behind stage area,
Hmm.
right? Like there's no way you can simulate that. And just the outcome measures of him getting back to work, being successful at work, his relationships at work, a touch anecdotal, admittedly, but you can definitely see the benefits and it makes sense once you think about it in
Yep.
those terms. We've talked about the technology and connectivity. Certainly, there is a barrier where we're going to have to educate people more than others. The connectivity, Wi-Fi, cellular data. We've definitely had some situations where connectivity isn't great, and you have to deal with some maybe poorer quality video, but nothing that we couldn't overcome at this point. And then the public policy piece, as it relates to workers' comp, there's definitely some jurisdictional differences from state to state, and so there've definitely been some situations where we had a really great candidate, but because of the certain jurisdiction, we may or may not have been able to do therapy. And so working through that is certainly a challenge.
And then we had a question come in. I knew you guys were going to be touching on this, so I waited. But a few minutes ago, how responsive is work comp insurance to this, and are they paying for this and or authorizing this for you?
Work comp has been in general responsive and open to it. I think the folks that we've been working with see that this is where everything is going, and they're also trying to respond to it. Um, Traditionally, we've been seeing them want to do more of like pilot programs rather than jump all in on it, which is great. I mean, honestly, it makes no difference to us. We recognize that we have
Hmm.
some stripes to earn here too and some trust to earn, and we're still learning too, so it's a really safe way for us to do it as well. Um, and being upfront with them about what we have figured out and maybe what we don't have figured out, so that's been really nice to see. And then the reimbursement is case by case, and we're working on those individually with our payers. All right, we're going to get through some decision making. Then I'm going to turn it over to Brad to show you guys some videos on the decision making process. So, who's a good candidate? Essentially, is what we're talking about right now. We've alluded to the fact that we're primarily serving folks with brain injury, spinal cord injury, other neurological injuries, stroke as an example, and limb loss. So, if you have something, if you're trying to think of someone who might be a good candidate for our program, hopefully that narrows it down for you a
Hmm.
little bit. And then a few other considerations. This is in our minds good for someone at a community-based level of care. So living independently or in some sort of community setting with or without a caregiver. And then I think it's always something to consider: what are their therapy needs and what are the goals? And so we're especially seeing this great for people who want to get back to an independent living situation, who want to get back to work. We've had several situations where we've actually kicked back driver's evals to our inpatient program. So someone who's on the cusp of being able to drive, we provide some therapy to them, and then we can send them back to a more formal driving program. So that's another example. But at the same time, if you had someone who's maybe a bit lower level and you need some caregiver training or caregiver support, that's a really nice option. And then someone who's accessing the community a lot. So Brad does a lot of therapy in local gyms and at the grocery store, some pathfinding, things like that. So there's so many applications, and just really think of it as, if I have someone go back to the community and they need to access that in a way that they're successful, this is really a great option.
Hmm.
The other thing that I would add to that is that our inpatient team is seeing a lot where they don't even make a recommendation to a traditional outpatient clinic, because that clinic is going to come in, that person's going to go in, the clinic's going to assess them, and they're going to say, like, there's not much I can do to help you because you've already maxed out your objective measures on balance and walking and talking and things like that. So if you look at it like that, um, they're often getting denied pretty quickly just because of need. Whereas we are able to see them in the absence of that traditional clinic because of the reasons I talked about.
Mhm.
So I think that's a really big consideration. And then certainly if you need clinical expertise in an area that's not available, or you want it to be more convenient, something else to consider. And then we've already talked about the rural versus metropolitan location, so I won't dig into that anymore, as well as the caregiver and clinical consultation. The clinical consultation, I know we've alluded to this, but we have had requests. We haven't done it yet, but people are asking, like, well, would you train that local clinician and help maybe provide them a blueprint? The answer is absolutely yes, as long as they're open to it, right?
Mhm.
And so that gets into the ego challenges that you might face.
We had another question, and just back to kind of access of expertise. It's along the lines of what you just touched on, but someone had a question on, isn't telemedicine not allowed for many states for work comp? Washington, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, for example. I know you touched a little bit on kind of the licensure,
Mhm.
but if you could kind of dig into that just a little bit more.
Yeah, I apologize. I don't have all the states just off the top of my head that it's not allowed, but like Washington is an example of the one that I do know about. And so we are just not providing services there. And I think the regulations are changing so quickly that we're just keeping an eye on it. And some of it is dependent on the need too. So if we had someone in Washington, we would maybe look into it, and that would trigger us to say, okay, well, has the jurisdictional have jurisdictional laws changed in that area? Our impression is that they're this. Are they different? And we're tackling those case by case. But okay, assessment wise, so we are doing a combination of in-person and virtual assessments. So there are definitely some folks who come through our program that transition directly to telerehab, and with those, we have the luxury of assessing them in person. Even for folks who don't come through our program who want to access telerehab, that's an option. So if you have someone who hasn't been through QLI and you need services, you could consider this as an option. But for those folks, we are sending a clinician to their environment to see exactly what it looks like, to assess every aspect of their day. And then if they need additional services, we're doing those virtually. And so, in like, just as an example, so let's just say they needed OT and PT. We would probably send an occupational therapist to assess the home workplace. Maybe Brad wants to do some um, therapy at the YMCA. We would see all of that, but then we would virtually conference Brad in to do his assessment. If we need some hands on there, we could be supportive of that. So that's been something that's been really nice to do. And then we're determining what disciplines we need through assessments. Clear and measurable goals is something that we're really focusing on. So making sure that they're functional and that there's a set duration and frequency so that our payers can understand, okay, what am I all in for here, at least on the front end? And then how might that look long term, and being collaborative through that process. All right, we're going to buzz through this. The platform, first and foremost, needs to be easy to access. I think that's been the biggest thing that we've been focusing on. Brad talked about the recording capabilities and the screen sharing aspects, which are huge for the reasons he mentioned. And then HIPAA compliance. Certainly, we're focused on privacy pretty heavily and making sure that we meet those expectations. So, don't want to get too much into the platform, but just a couple considerations there. And then what you need to do this at the very basic level is a phone or tablet that's smartphone enabled. A cellular data plan allows things to be very mobile. And then some devices and equipment are definitely needed, and the wireless headphones in a situation where you want to have some private conversations has been nice. Also allowing for, you know, walking around and that sort of thing. So a little bit on the equipment here too. All right. So at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is connect therapy, and in this case, the physical aspects of therapy, to someone's life. And um, telerehab allows us to do that in a really meaningful, individualized, and engaging way. And so, what we saw after our last presentation and the feedback that the group had was, well, can you show us how it works? And at the time, we didn't have a ton of examples of that, but this time we do. So Brad's gonna take you through that.
Great. If I'm thinking of things on a an inpatient side of things, I am kind of going through some of these steps in a similar manner here, right? So what we have listed is what I might think through from a telerehab session standpoint. But if I'm meeting with someone in person, I'm looking at what does my environment look like from a learning standpoint, contextual learning specifically. How have I prepared for this session? So do I know where they were previously, and do I have some of the goals in the back of my mind and how we're going to get there, right? Where am I going to place myself to make sure that this individual stays safe or to cue them appropriately? What technology might I need to know how to use, right? In the inpatient setting, working with spinal cord injury or brain injury or stroke, like we do at QLI, there's a lot of rehabilitation technology for body weight support or retraining gait, using electrical stimulation. And you got to know how to use those pretty proficiently so you can utilize it as a tool, with the end goal being that we're able to serve the individual so they can get back to life or to regaining movement that is desired. From a telerehab side of things, it just looks a little bit different. I have a computer screen in front of me, and then it's the individual's world on the other side of that screen. So I do need to get acquainted with whatever environment they're in, whether that's the local gym or with their home. I need to know what resources are available to me there to be able to utilize. I need to think about the environment behind me. You'll see some examples of me doing a poor job of that in the videos later. But just, etiquette when you're on the other side of the screen, making sure, I'm not looking down at the screen. It's more of like a face-to-face connection, that the background is nice. Those are things that we want to think about from an environmental standpoint.
Just to make it very clear, this is not a stock photo. This is actually a photo of Brad that you're looking at currently.
Yeah, I was curious how you got the face of
Yeah, I don't know. There's videos of me coming up later too, so I feel really exposed and vulnerable.
Well, your
right
technique
now.
and your form looks fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. And then, from an IT troubleshooting standpoint, you might ask, yeah, are there going to be issues? Yeah, there's going to be issues, but we've actually worked pretty closely with our IT team so that we know how to resolve a lot of those in the moment, so it doesn't turn into a bigger problem. So like Steve mentioned, we want to be able to show you a couple videos of how this works. And so first example I have here is a 61-year-old gentleman. He had a spinal cord injury May 5th of 2019. Initially, he was a T5 Asia B injury, which just to kind of bring that down a little bit, that's about the level of his shoulder blades, and the Asia B part of that means he only had sensation below his level of injury, no movement. Over the course of time, he progressed to being a T9 Asia D injury. So now we're thinking a little bit closer to mid to low back, where he's regained function above mid to low back, and now he's an Asia D. So he's gone from B to C to D, which means that he has sensation and a good amount of movement below his level of injury, enabling him to do things differently, like standing up for himself, starting to do some basic walking. He's planning to, or was going back to a metropolitan area in Iowa, had a 2-story home, bedroom, bathroom on his second level. And here are some of the goals that he had. He wanted to be able to stand up from low surfaces so he could get out of a kitchen chair, get out of his couch that he enjoys spending time in, watching his grandkids play, and more importantly, on a day-to-day basis, being able to get off of the toilet on his own. He wanted to be able to do stand pivot transfers independently and walk short distances within his home so he could get into the bathroom. Very social individual. He and his wife are well connected, have a lot of really great friends, and it was important to him that he could still go over to other people's houses, and if he needed to use the restroom, that he, at this point would be able to stand up and walk into it. Something that we maybe just don't think about on an everyday basis, but that was really important to him. And then some other goals were just improving his core strength and his leg strength so that he could walk better. And then being able to do his own stretching program so he wasn't relying on his wife to do that for him. It was really important to him that he kind of he maintains a relationship with his wife and she doesn't become caregiver for him. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through each one of these goals with you, and I'll show you a video of working on that goal in person, and I'll show you a video of working on that goal through a telerehab medium. What I want you guys to think about or observe as I go through these videos is the outcome here all that different? What I'm seeing, is it all that different? And what does it look like environment to environment. I have turned the volume off on these videos, so I will talk through them and I'll kind of scroll through them a little bit, so we're not just watching 3 minutes of video on each one of these. So first one here, the goal is to be able to stand up from low surfaces in order to get out of the kitchen chair, the couch, or the toilet. Here we're in a therapy room, we're on the mat, he's got a walker in front of him, and I've thought about just the environment and where I want to be set up. So you'll see I'm in front of him, I'm kind of anticipating him standing, and I want to make sure that I'm going to block his knees just in case they might buckle in this location. Okay, so he kind of shoots up off that mat. See if we can get another one here. Okay, so I see him do that and I'm thinking, all right, I have a mat behind him. I've already set up my environment safely, but if I'm going to do this in a real life context at home, he may need a little bit of support to make sure that he's safe while he does that. Much better. Okay, let's look at this from a telerehab medium now. So we are actually in his bathroom on his toilet with what the setup is going to look like. And like I mentioned, I've decided I need a caregiver in place to be able to perform this specific activity. So I give instruction to the caregiver on where to stand, where to place the walker, and what to perhaps anticipate, right? We saw this gentleman kind of fall backwards onto the mat. I want to make sure as he gets up that this caregiver is ready to give him the support that he may need. But what's really important here is that we're in his environment and we're doing this from the exact surface that he needs to be able to do it from.
Brad, don't you think the other thing too is you can kind of predict, just based on the position of his legs, where he's at on the seat, how the actual sit to stand is going to go, don't you think?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, as therapists, we're looking for some of those cues, right? So make sure his feet are underneath him, make sure he's scooted out far enough. And so we would be able to catch that whether or not he's right in front of me or I see that on a video.
Yeah, if his feet are sticking out in front of that toilet, I know he's not going to make it up. He's just going to kind of push himself back onto the toilet again, right? You see the caregiver, she's helping out with placement of the walker, making sure it's not going to tip on him. See one more here. And what we do through the course of this session is we just kind of rep out that movement and it gets better and better. Again, he's going to get feedback on that one. He didn't lean forward very well. So he needs to make sure that he leans forward while he's standing up. You notice his trunk just kind of stayed back before he stood. So those are all things that, again, I can just see via the video that I would see in person, and I can give some of those verbal cues to the individual that's there helping him.
And I'm guessing you would build like a strengthening program to match this too, right?
Absolutely. So, you're looking at some of our other goals. It was leg strengthening. And what we'll show you in these videos is some of the bridging techniques that we're going to use for him. But the sit to stands or the work that I might have him do at the local gym are going to be cueing in on some of the muscles on his butt and then some of the muscles on the front side of his thighs that are really, really assisting with that type of movement. So everything is working toward some of these goals. All right, here's another one doing stand pivot transfers on his own. Maybe. Okay. So we've got the sit to stand part down. Now we're going to work on actually stepping. I'm just standby support at this point. What I also know from a strength aspect, because I've just watched him move his legs, I know that his right leg is stronger than his left leg. So I've actually asked him in this scenario when I'm in person to go to his weak side so I can anticipate what may go poorly because I know that he's going to do better going to his strong side, being able to step out. Okay, so we'll look at this from a telerehab medium. And again, the goal of this is maybe once he gets off of the toilet that he's able to complete a stand pivot transfer So instructed the caregiver to bring his wheelchair over for him. Get that set up. And even as she does this, I'm making sure that she's locked the brakes, that the chair is close to him, that the seatbelt is off of the seat before he moves over toward the wheelchair.
The other thing I would say is, let's just say this person had a brain injury. We would also be training the caregiver on the cues, the order to do that in, and talking to them about how important it is to have that happen. So then either she is consistently doing it every single time, or she's able to train somebody else to do it consistently every time. So depending on the diagnosis, our approach is going to be different there too.
So again, this is a transfer to his left. So just because of the environmental setup of his bathroom, that's another reason why I had him doing those transfers to his left side and the inpatient side of things, right? So we were trying to practice what it would look in real life. Well, now here we are actually in real life, in the real environment.
And part of that assessment process too, Steve, you touched on that. Like, are you meeting with those caregivers and kind of giving them like a heads up, like, hey, this is what each session is going to look like basically prefacing each session?
Yeah. So again, love to talk about why we're doing things rather than just what to do, right? How to think about it instead of just what to do. So those are conversations that we're trying to have with family, with caregivers, or with the individual, if it's just that individual that we're meeting with ahead of time. So we kind of know big picture. These are the things that we're working on together, right? Now, this is the how we're going to get there.
The
Okay.
other thing, I think we also have Claire, who handles a lot of our behind the scenes work here. She would probably tell this person, hey, today Brad's going to work on stand pivot transfers with you in your bathroom. So you need to make sure you have your wheelchair and everything set up and ready to go. So we're not wasting time. They video in from their living room and they have to climb up six stairs, and then we're wasting time getting prepped. Like, we're sending all of that on the front end so that we can be really efficient with time. So but that goes back to the preparation. If Brad hasn't prepared for a session or two leading up to this, like, that doesn't happen.
Here's another one of the goals: walking short distances with the intent of being able to get into the bathroom within his home or within the home of one of his friends. Okay, so we're trying to set up this room just like the walk may be within his home. Kind of see what that walking looks like.
But like, things that we can't account for is, like, we don't know what his carpet's like, or we might know, but we can't simulate that, right?
Right.
So, I mean, I think that's some things to be looking at the next one.
Okay. So let's look at this within his home. At this point, we're walking back from the bathroom over to his bed. We do have a caregiver present for this. And you'll see, there's actually a change in surface there. So he goes from tile or a laminate floor over onto a carpet floor. And at the end of this, he's going to have to do that stand pivot transfer. So kind of building up to all of these things, right? So, and again, I'm just kind of talking caregiver through placement, where she needs to be, making sure the individual is feeling okay. And then I usually try to give feedback at the end of a task, right? So not during the task. From a learning standpoint, I want to be able to just reflect on that at the end of each task that we do. All right, so we also talked about building strength, right? One of his goals is walking better. You saw how he walked. It was a little bit more difficult for him to get one of his legs through. And so we're working on specific muscle groups to build up his strength. So here in person, I have hands on. I'm kind of giving him the cueing that he requires. Here's another muscle group that we'll be working on, as well as the hands-on assist that would need to be present. He's working on the muscles that help him kind of swing his leg through. Right, so let's look at that in the home environment. Caregivers present here. So we're going to talk through positioning. He does need a little bit of assistance, just getting his legs up. So she's spotting Okay. Once he's where he needs to be, we're working through that activity. Later on here, we roll onto the side, we complete the same activity. And again, this is just verbal cueing on hand positioning for me, making sure that the caregiver knows where her hands need to be, as well as what to kind of look out for compensation patterns that may be happening. But you'll see, the outcome of each of those exercises is exactly what we desire to happen.
We haven't talked about this, but our caregivers, do they tend to have any credentialing? What is their ability level usually?
Uh, no credentialing,
Okay.
usually. I mean, you're either looking at maybe a family member
Okay.
helping out, so you're teaching from scratch. But again, once you kind of teach through some of these things, they pick up on it relatively quickly. Even you'll see with the next example that I give you after this individual, we have a caregiver that's dual language, so English and Spanish. She's doing some of the translating if the individual himself does not understand everything that we're talking about. And so for her, there are things that we maybe need to spend a little bit more time on teaching, but once she gets it, it really makes our therapy sessions go pretty smoothly. Um, Here's a case of me doing some of the stretching for this individual in person versus in the home environment. I'm teaching him how to do that within his own context, his own environment on his own. So we work on sitting up, and then we're going to work on stretching some of those same muscle groups that I was just doing for him. Okay. All right. Here's an individual. Again, this is a Spanish-speaking individual. You're going to see has caregiver with him. For this gentleman, it was really important to him and his wife for him to be able to get down onto the floor to play with his kids. He has two young daughters, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And you can imagine that his home was very busy. And so, again, he wanted to be able to get down onto the floor and back up on his own. We started with his activity with him needing to use a couch or a chair to be able to kind of pull himself up from. But now we've shifted to I have caregiver with what I call eyeball support, right? So standby support. And I've told her ahead of time when my face was flashing up there that when he's getting back up, as he's starting to push up through his legs, that's where he could potentially lose his balance and stumble a little bit. So she's on a little higher guard once he gets to this position right here. Good. All right. So let's compare that with just a few weeks down the line. Now we're starting to do this for speed. So we've gotten the repetition in. I've even taught the caregiver how to do this with him. And one of the things I didn't mention in that previous video is that we were close to a wall in case he needed something stable to kind of put his arm against while we were doing that. So just thinking about the environment, thinking about caregiver position. Now I've asked caregiver to kind of step away, and I'm asking this gentleman to do this for speed. So you see his speed has improved, his coordination has improved, his strength has improved. So that's a pretty smooth movement. He gets down on the floor, he plays with his kids. You can see all of their toys and stuff in the background right there. So we're actually in the area that he may be doing this to most frequently. All right. One more for you here. This is an example of an individual who's on her own. So she does not have a caregiver with her, but for some of the same reasons that Steve was talking about earlier, she lives in a metropolitan area, but it was more convenient for her to do some of this within her home. Her husband was a successful businessman, and he was pretty busy guy. He's out and about a lot, and she said, "I can do Uber, but it just gets fairly expensive." So we're going to look at this. And this is an example of strengthening her hip flexors in order to help her swing her right leg through better. We're going to move into some standing exercises where, again, we're working with the hip flexor muscle groups in a little bit different way. I'm going to ask her to start stepping up onto that yoga block. There's some good examples here of just knowing what equipment she has in her home environment so that we're able to fully utilize those and assist in some of the exercises. So you see that she has a couple bands attached to her chairs. She has this yoga block here that we're using as as a step for her. And we're trying to work more frontal plane or side to side movements in order to strengthen some of the muscles around her hip. Okay, Steve, I'll let you take it over from here.
Yeah, we're basically done here. Just wanted to share a little bit about what some of our clients are saying. I think this first one is from an actual client, and it definitely lends to the idea of not having to make up what's going on or what's going to happen at work. Instead, we're actually able to work on it. So nice reinforcement there. And then this one is from a wife of a client, where this collaborative approach and feeling like she could take on the responsibility of the therapy, going back to what Brad said of giving them the tools, not only sharing the information for them, but helping them apply that, make decisions about that, and make decisions about that long term. And that's something that, is really, really important, obviously.
Yep.
And while Steve's kind of wrapping up here, I just want to say this is a perfect time to ask some questions. And then I'm also going to launch a poll on the screen. If I can from here. So please send questions in. I'm monitoring that. We've got Steve and Brad here for a couple more minutes. And then let's see here. All right, back over to you guys. So that's going to be on the screen for about 2 minutes or so. So if you're looking to receive a CEU certificate, as always, if you attend our webinars, this is what we go off of to send you that follow-up email. So please answer that.
I don't think we have any additional information. If we have some questions that have come in while we were talking, we can take those.
Yep.
Or if you guys have some.
Absolutely.
Glad to-
So we had a few people just kind of ask about, you briefly touched on outcomes. And somebody just asked, what are some good outcomes to maybe record to start getting data on how successful telerehab is?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the assessment process, and at the end of the day, the assessment data that we get from those is pretty similar to what you would get face to face. So being able to measure strength, albeit it might be in a different way, but we would have some strength measurements. We would have some potential range of motion measurements. We didn't talk about this, but there is software that you can measure range of motion through video, and so there's ways to get that. And we're
balance, functional mobility. I mean,
yeah.
the example of the gentleman getting up off of the floor, there's kind of tangible results there that are noted within, the notes that we would send off to the funding source as well.
So, I mean, in a lot of ways, they wouldn't differ all that much from a physical perspective. Certainly, we are looking at things like caregiver strain, if there is a caregiver, and how that caregiver is dealing with the responsibility that it takes, as well as, if we look at someone holistically, how are they emotionally doing? And so this certainly is geared more towards a physical type of situation, but in anything that we do, we are looking at this from all angles, knowing that physical progress and abilities are certainly affected by someone's emotional status, what's maybe going on in the home, their social outlets, and are they getting out of the house? And so it goes back to that slide where the therapy has to be individualized, engaging, and meaningful. And so, are you able to get down on the floor with your kids? And we know that if that doesn't happen, that's probably going to have a pretty big effect on someone's emotional state. Mm-hmm. And so we are looking at a lot of those types of things.
There's a few folks saying they're not seeing the poll. If you're looking to answer the poll and you aren't seeing it or you're having issues, just email qlibwebinars@qliomaha.com and we can make sure you get credit for that. All right, see, we got Steve and Brad. We have a few more questions here. Somebody addressed kind of the safety issue, which you touched on a little bit, but it seems like there could be a safety concern with telerehab if the patient is a fall risk. How do you address this?
Yeah. So again, that's kind of knowing how high of a fall risk that they might be. So, we still do Berg balance assessments and functional gait assessments to know what types of activities would be difficult for the individual that would be performing them. As you saw in the videos for the gentleman with the floor transfers, that first one, he was a higher fall risk at that time. That was one of the reasons we were working on floor transfers, was if you ended up on the floor, how would you get back up and how much support would you need? In that video, I had a caregiver a little bit closer to him to provide adequate amount of support. So I needed to know he could fall here, and that's what I'm telling her to anticipate through that movement. Whereas as he got better with things, he didn't need that same level of support. So it's knowing what their functional abilities are, knowing if they have dizziness, that we could set that off with particular movements, and the individual that is with them in person needs to be aware of that. So there's an educational component there too.
Or you maybe not make the decision to treat them in an environment where they're alone if you're really worried about that. So you might say, well, because that could happen, maybe I say, like, let's go to the YMCA today. So if it happens, there's someone around. And then we always have the fail safe of we've gathered emergency information
Yep.
and we have things in place for worst case scenario.
Set up the environment for safety too. So if you're going to do a task that you feel could be a little bit harder and could put them at a higher risk for falling, let's do that in front of something or with your hand on something instead of just in open space.
Yep.
We have a few more questions, so please stick around if you have some time. I know Brad and Steve have a couple more minutes, so I'm going to cover a few of these. And then if we didn't get to your question, I will send all these over to Steve and Brad, and they will reach out to you. But I think there's a few questions around the involvement of an MD. And after discharge, what that looks like. There's a specific situation somebody touched on that. I had a situation where a doctor put a PT on hold because they said that it was not needed after discharge from a post-acute provider. Have we ran into those situations? How do we overcome that? What does that look like on the approval side from insurance?
Again, and very similar to normal and traditional outpatient therapy, that we do need a script, just like you would need to initiate therapy for a traditional clinic. A couple things that we've run into, and more of either a reminder or an FYI. This program is not overseen by an MD. You think of this program as a traditional outpatient clinic. There's no physician oversight for that. So that's one thing we're always recommending people have their own primary care physician or a rehab doc to help direct some of this care. I will also say we are running into situations where we have a case manager who's on board and would love to use these services, but you have maybe a physician who traditionally refers to a local provider. And so we are having to navigate some of those decisions and preferences of physicians, and that's not easy, to be honest, but we're trying to build relationships with physicians, trying to educate them on what we can do, but that's a bit of a barrier. At the end of the day, it comes down to education and really showing them why additional therapy would make sense. And for us, we all also sit in this position where we want to advocate for our clients, but we also have partners on the work comp side to consider. And so a lot of times this is a pretty collaborative discussion, and we're trying to understand, okay, is the work comp payer, as an example, on board with this, and how heavy do we advocate for this client? Do we need to call and reach out to the physician? Do we need to write some justification to the physician? So there's lots of ways to tackle that, but getting physician buy-in certainly is a challenge and is necessary in many cases.
Just to touch on a few questions about the fluidity of the therapy sessions. If it was a little choppy on your end, it's just through the webinar platform. The actual therapy sessions are very fluid. There's not a delay or anything. I just want to make that very clear. If the video playback was choppy on your end.
And I was skipping through the video.
And you were skipping through the video, so it was loading a little bit. Surface, somebody was asking questions about just kind of surfaces. You touched on this a little bit, but in your experience, somebody asked about carpeted areas versus tile areas. Are you trying to perform tasks on a specific area more frequently, or is it just this is your home environment, we have to kind of tackle all of that?
Yeah, I think it's more of I need to know what environment looks like, whether that's the gym or that's at home. For the gentleman that you saw in those videos, things that my PT mind is thinking about are he's not lifting his toes up very well when he's walking, so he has a higher risk of catching his toe on the floor and kind of scuffing his foot, or even potentially tripping, which is a fall risk at that point, right? And so I need to know if there's a change in surface from a laminate flooring or tile flooring where it's maybe a little smoother and his toes less likely to get caught, to carpet where it's a little more sticky, more friction. That could be a point where we need to be on high guard, right? If there's a caregiver present there. Some folks have thicker pile carpet in their houses. That makes it more difficult to walk on. So just thinking through environmental factors like that.
Okay. We had a few folks actually had the same question around your answers to the doctor's orders. Does it have to specifically say tele-PT or tele-rehab, or just orders for PT?
We have been requesting that it say tele-PT or tele-rehab just for completeness purposes. Um, that's actually a really good question. I'm not sure jurisdictionally how that looks. We have just been over planning on that and over communicating and telling physicians and telling case managers, like, here's the way that it's going to be happening.
For
Make
sure.
sure that you get the order to read this way, so that there's no questions about that. So we've been, just for completeness purposes,
Okay.
doing that. So
And we touched on this a little bit when we were planning this, and you didn't dive too much into it. This was more based on the physical side of things, but we had quite a few questions actually. If you could talk about kind of the multimodality, speech, occupational therapy, PT, and the involvement all around, like the whole program, and just maybe more on the providing of the cognitive treatment, or has this primarily been focused on physical impairments at your site?
so we have tackled all of the above.
Okay.
And um, I think if you guys are familiar with QLI at all, you know that our inpatient program, which by the way is very separate from our telerehab program, they are two separate teams, and information still has to flow from our inpatient team to our telerehab team should someone go through one program and transition to another. So that gets a little bit tricky and can be a little confusing, but essentially think of them as two different teams. And on the inpatient side, we take a very collaborative and look at things from every single angle: physical, cognitive, speech. And then that usually transitions to, well, these are the main focuses of telerehab. And we would get the same thing from someone coming outside of QLI's inpatient program to telerehab. But once we complete assessments, we make determinations on which disciplines need to be involved. And then the clinical team on the telerehab side collaborates pretty similarly to what we do on the inpatient side. And we say, well, okay, Brad, you're going to take XYZ, and Mel, you're going to take this, and here's how it crosses over, but here's how it's also separate. So that we're not being redundant, but we're also being supportive of each other. And then we do have pretty regular meetings where we're talking about, hey, how are things going with so-and-so? And do we need to tweak this? Or are they struggling at this? And again, psychology is a situation where we're saying, hey, Jody's our psychologist. Jody, are you seeing anything? How are they doing emotionally? Are they reporting challenges? And so taking all that information and tweaking. So I don't know if you would add to that at all, Brad.
I'm just thinking of one case example that we had where a gentleman that had a brain injury for a couple of years, and his family was very good with, kind of helping him through his day. But as we kind of assessed him, we realized there's a lot more that he could be doing for himself, right? So there's certainly a physical component of, okay, how can we improve his strength or his functional mobility, his walking ability? But then from an OT standpoint, what are some of the ADLs or the cooking that he could be doing for himself based off of what we're seeing functionally that you're not allowing him to do? Then from a psychology standpoint, we have a psychologist who's working with the parents in this situation, as well as the individual, and just talking through, how are you guys feeling about these changes, right? Are you scared of making some of these changes? So in that situation, putting all of our forces together helped decrease caregiver support pretty significantly, which is really, really great. And this is a person that was a couple years post-injury at that point.
If you guys, we just have one more question, I think, to wrap it up. And a few people actually talked about this. It was just more about that in-person evaluation, if that is always necessary, and what we're yeah, basically if that's always necessary or how we're handling more the assessment side or the evaluation side initially.
So if someone comes through QLI's program and they transition to telerehab, we assess them before they discharge our inpatient facility, and we complete all of that and make sure that that's in place before they leave. So all of our inpatient ones happen in person. All of our ones that don't come through QLI also have some sort of in-person assessment. We've been pretty, I think, cautious in one way, but also I think we really believe that it's necessary beyond the safety concerns of it, because at some point there's, at least at this point, there's no replacement for being there, seeing it for yourself, making sure that we have our bases covered, and the person doesn't need more physical assistance than what we expect through video. So the long, the short answer is we assess everyone in person in some way, shape, or form, and I don't see that changing in the near future. But I'll never say never.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We are going to go ahead and end the webinar now. Please join us for next month. We're actually going to have Dr. Snell back on. He's going to be giving a presentation about shunts, and the application of shunts, and more in that brain injury stroke population. So it's a new one for us on the webinar platform. So please join us. We're pretty excited about that. Also, as always, check us out on our social media platforms. We have a lot of amazing content on there, just about some stories of some residents. And also, if you have any referrals or any questions, feel free to email Steve or Brad directly. They are very responsive. They'll get back to you. And if I didn't get to your question, I'm going to get those over to Steve and Brad, and they'll reach out and respond. So, all
Thank
right.
you.